Before we move on to the LFO section, I want to show you a kind of real-world scenario of where velocity to filter can enhance the natural timbre of a sound. Now, to give you a bit more of a clinical example, I'm reducing the velocity to amplitude to 0, so all notes will be at the same volume, so we're not going to get distracted by volume. Now, I have a series of notes programmed up here with velocities going from low to high, back down to low, and they'll all sound at the same volume now. Etc. Now, with a low-pass filter, if I have the frequency set very low like that, if I dial this up, what's going to happen now is that the lower velocities are going to sound darker, and as the velocities increase, it'll sound brighter. And I can exaggerate that. Or I can do the opposite, where the lower velocities sound brighter and the higher ones sound darker, which is less natural, but could be an interesting effect. And we can similarly influence resonance. So just some examples of how we can get real-world use out of these settings. Now, the LFO section, let me put this back up. The LFO section is basically a periodic waveform generator. So it generates these shapes, square wave, sine wave, triangle wave, etc. And it's used to modulate either pitch, filter, or level, or pan at specific rates. And the rate can be either in cycles per second, or we can sync it to tempo. Now, one realistic use for this is to create a vibrato. Let me give you an example. I'm going to hold down a note, and I have LFO 1 set, and I'll increase the rate here, and we'll use this regular default one. And if I dial up pitch, you'll hear it oscillate to pitch, and it'll probably sound something like a siren at dramatic levels. And this is a nice way of getting familiar with the different shapes. It's a random shape. Now, if you want to get a realistic vibrato, you might set it to a sine wave and set a much narrower range of pitch oscillation, narrower depth, and maybe a slower cycle. Maybe faster. Like that. Maybe less depth. Now, we can also use this to modulate the filter parameters. So if I put this down low, we can modulate based on these shapes. I'm not sure how useful that is for orchestral sounds, but it could be interesting for an effect. We can modulate volume to create a tremolo type of effect. And with pan, it should be noted, it'll only work with LFO2, so we have two separate LFOs here. Let's go back to LFO1 and look at the rest of the parameters. Now we have sync, which allows the rate to be tied to musical subdivisions rather than freely synced based on cycles per second. The depth is the depth of modulation, and when we have LFO depth up here, it allows velocity to control the depth. Now, fade will delay the onset of the LFO cycle. In other words, it'll fade it up, and that's great for our vibrato effect. So back to this. Let's lower the depth. Maybe we want to have it without the vibrato for the first X number of milliseconds before that vibrato kicks in. So it'll delay the onset of the vibrato, which is a nice natural effect. Phase delays, or rather offsets, where within the waveform it's going to start. So for example, in this square wave example, it can start at different places within this square shape. And finally, we have the free button here. When this is unlit, it means each new note will start its own LFO. So let's slow this down, increase the depth so we can hear it a bit more dramatically. And as I hit multiple notes, you'll hear them all run on their own independent LFO. And when this is in, they'll all sync to the same LFO. Next video, we'll continue with the envelope section.